Are you suffering from low energy? Did you know that there's 5 frequently overlooked causes that you can start acting on now? Welcome to the Wild Wisdom Show, hosted by a medical doctor with a different spin on women's health. I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, and today we are going to be talking about these 5 frequently overlooked causes that you can start addressing right away to start feeling more energetic tomorrow. And I wanted to introduce to you a special guest speaker that I have joining with me today. I'm so excited to have her here. It's Anya, is a functional health practitioner, a clinical nutritionist, and founder of the Wellnest, a worldwide virtual practice that specializes in women's gut health and hormone health. Hi, Anya. It's so lovely to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. Yay. Speaking about a very important subject, because how frequently do we see this in the clinic, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a common issue. And the thing with low energy is it's often the first thing that people start to experience when something starts to go wrong with their health. And over time, more things will pop up and that low energy will get worse and worse. But I often say to people that, the very, very first sign of any kind of issue, it's going to be that low energy, right? And we're going to cover why that is, which means that pretty much every person who's suffering from some kind of problem with their health is also suffering from low energy.
Yeah, definitely. You're so right. It's one of those very obvious symptoms that we can trace to something so much deeper than that. And I think, there's so many other symptoms that we can overlook. There's so many things that we can maybe take a pill for, but having lack of energy just disrupts our lives so substantially that there's just no overlooking it. Maybe we can down some more coffee, but even so, after a while, you'll notice that that doesn't really help. So, you know, we can't overlook it. We have to deal with it. And that's what we're going to do today, right?
Yeah, awesome. So excited. All right, let's dive right in. And at the end, I'm gonna get you to share with us where people. I also want to find out later on a little bit about how you got into this space, because it's such a good one to be in, right? We met at a conference. We connected right away. I just was so in love with your positive energy and how you brought like this really amazing, high vibration kind of conversation every time we talked. And so I'm just so happy to have you here today because you are like the epitome of energy. So it's so wonderful.
Oh my gosh, thank you. And Patricia, that was part of the healing journey I had to go through. Like I didn't just come up with this energy out of nowhere, right? Like this was part and parcel of me taking a very holistic approach to my own health. And so that's what allowed me to then have that expertise to share with other people as well after, getting some credentials and all of the school and all of that. But yeah, so thank you for that. Energy matches energy. So that's why we connected. Thank you again.
I agree. Energy does match energy. All right, let's start with that first cause. And, you provided these topics and we talked back and forth about them in preparation, and we are in full agreement with all of this. And metabolic health, so crucial. What are your thoughts on metabolic health? And for some people who are joining us today, they may not understand what do you mean by metabolic health? Like people generally understand metabolism, right? Like, oh, she has a high metabolism, he has a low metabolism. And it's usually in the context of, oh, you could eat anything you want. And so you have a high metabolism. Whereas if I eat anything, I gain weight, I have a low metabolism. Are we talking about that? Are we talking about something different? What are your thoughts?
Well, let's use the example of that idea of someone having a lower high metabolism when it comes to food that they eat. So, food that we eat needs to undergo chemical processes in our body. So, once we eat it, we of course digest it, and then apart from that, after that, we have to then absorb it and do something with what it is that we've absorbed. Part of this whole process that we understand as metabolism is that, it's a chemical process that the body is going through, just like these bajillion other chemical processes that our bodies go through on a daily basis that we may not be aware of and we don't see. So, in order for any movement to take place, for my hands to be moving right now, we're having a metabolically related process. There's energy that's going from my cells, and it's powering the muscles that are moving in my arms right now. That is also part and parcel of metabolic health. So when we consider metabolic health to be any chemical process that's happening in our bodies, then our horizon or our understanding of what encompasses metabolic health becomes so wide, right? Because then that becomes everything that our body does. Everything is a chemical process, from movement, from my hair growing, to the food that I'm eating, to elimination, to the way that I breathe, to the way that I create hormones, to the way that I create energy. All of these things are metabolic, right?
Oh, 100%, 100%. And it's interesting because what creates that energy within our cells, it's almost like a story from Star Wars, and if you don't know Star Wars, you're probably much younger than us. But it's the energy production comes from these little organelles, like there are these cells within the cell. So we have our cells, and within the cell, there's another tiny little organelle called a mitochondria, right? And the mitochondria actually were bacteria, single-celled bacteria that millions of years ago migrated into another cell, and they were so good at making energy that that cell that they got into benefited from that energy production. So as long as that bigger cell fed that smaller mitochondria will take that food, turn it into energy, which then the bigger cell would use. And then millions of years later, many of those cells got together and they formed animals and eventually species. And we were one of the outputs of that, the humans. And we are basically a collection of cells with multiple little mitochondria inside of it that are taking the energy from our sugar, our protein, our fat, and making energy, and they need oxygen. So actually we do not use oxygen, our mitochondria use the oxygen. And then the output of that is the energy. So they're like our little battery packs in our cells, I like to call them. And what's fascinating is I came across a recent study that showed that our metabolism, actually everybody's metabolism is the same at the same life stage. So all babies have the same metabolism, all kids have the same metabolism, all adults and all elders. What changes is our health and our ability for our metabolism to work at their optimal capacity, which is very fascinating. It was a very groundbreaking study, because the idea of, oh, you have a high metabolism and you have a low metabolism, you were born with that. It's actually been proven to not be true. We all have the same metabolism, but how we influence that metabolism through what we eat, what we drink, what we breathe, what we put on our skin, the thoughts that we think, that's what influences our energy production capacity. What are your thoughts on that?
That is, well, first of all, I need to give you a round of applause because you just took us from Big Bang to the history of evolution, just in what was that, like less than 2 minutes? That was incredible. So congratulations. um, but let's talk about this. You're right. That is absolutely true. Studies have found that metabolic health is something that we affect in our day-to-day lives. Unless we're born with some genetic, and to be honest, if we had a genetic related let's call it an issue with our metabolic health, that would be fatal, right? That would be fatal because of, and we just went through how important or how central metabolic health is to every function in our body. But for the most part, for the most of us walking around, we're affecting our metabolic health either negatively or positively every day. And that information is coming from our environment. And as you said, from within as well, the information, there's feedback loops that are happening in our bodies continuously. Information is being given to us by our outside environment, and our inside environment is then taking that, assimilating it, and making changes and doing protocols and, sending signals based on what's happening. So you can imagine the beauty of this whole thing. And what, Patricia, you've just said is that we have an incredible opportunity to fine tune and optimize our metabolic health. Because if it's what we're doing that makes the huge difference between someone who has a high metabolism and a lower metabolism, then that means this might be under our control. And studies have shown that it is mostly within our control. We may be predisposed to certain things, but epigenetics, meaning that the things that we do and how they affect our genealogy, how they affect the way that our body is producing and doing and being, we have an opportunity here. So this is exactly what you said. I love it. Love that research.
And what could you give some top things that negatively affect our metabolic health or our mitochondria, and a few things that positively affect, just off the top of your head, what comes to mind?
Well, let's think about, first of all, what does a mitochondria, what does that eat? What do we know that it loves? The answer to that is minerals. It loves minerals, right? Minerals are what it uses to do the chemical reactions that create energy in our body. They're called what we call cofactors. So when we have a mineral rich diet, which most of us are lacking some minerals, we are going to notice a metabolic change because it's not giving the mitochondria what they need to live, right? Adversely, if we are on the other side of that, if we're having a mineral dense diet, minerals coming from the earth, coming from colorful plants, colorful foods, making sure that we are not shying away from, I'm a proponent of a whole food diet being more so, and also including meat. So, animal protein is something that I do believe in my practice to be very healing. And so some of the beauty around that is that if you are eating a whole foods diet, meaning that, it is not changed, processed, pretty much the kind of diet that you can grab on your own, hunt on your own. If you were in the middle of a field with a knife, you can create this diet. That's the kind of diet I'm thinking about. In the middle of the field with a knife you would not expect there to be a cereal box, right? So we need to start thinking about, well, what is our whole food? We're having a whole foods diet. Those are mineral rich diets. And so we're naturally going to be giving our mitochondria the fuel that it needs. So mineral density. And I think people are also on the topic of mineral density. I think a lot of people are having a little bit less salt than they think they should be having, than they should actually be having, I should say. So, in the 80s and 90s, there was this huge kind of concern, and more research is debunking this, that salt is a primary killer because of creating cardiovascular risk. But what we're seeing is that there's a certain amount of salt that our body really needs for functioning. And without that salt content, we're really doing more disservice to our bodies. We're actually creating the kind of conditions that create hypertension, that create, the kinds of things that previously we were blaming salt for. So salt in specifically high grade, not processed. I'm talking about sea salt. I'm talking about, Himalayan pink salt. I'm talking about rotating your salts. So not just having the same salt on your table day in and day out. Think about rotating your salts, because every salt, natural salt, has a very different mineral content. So, from in my house, for example, we'll do gray salt one week and then switch it to pink Himalayan salt and then switch it to another type of salt. There are so many fun and they're tasty types of salts that exist, and you can just experiment with them. They're beautiful. It looks beautiful on a table. Part of that also when you're attracted to the food that you're eating, your body is assimilating it in a very different way. So experiment with salts, experiment with minerals.
Oh, I love that. There are so many things you just, provided there that are very actionable strategies. I, for one, will start to rotate my salts. I use primarily the pink Himalayan salt. And it's true, I dove into the research, and natural salts have more minerals than synthetic table salt has 2 minerals, calcium and chloride, and then it may be fortified with iodine. And natural salt has at least those two plus around 10 more other minerals that are vital for our healthy functioning and are not present in ultra processed foods. Civilizations have lived and died based on the salt trade, like where there have been civil wars almost fought in Italy when one city threatened to close down the access to salt for another city. It was that important for their civilization. So it's been with us for eons. It is definitely 100% agree with you. Super important, not just for mitochondria, but for our adrenal glands, which create our cortisol hormone, all those things. And the other thing I want to comment on is the meat, eating the meat. I am an omnivore. I do eat meat, and I eat a plant-rich diet. So I get my minerals primarily from my plants. I get my building blocks from a lot of my building blocks from meat. And I know that for people who are trying to minimize or avoid meat, my recommendation is that iron is one of those key minerals for the mitochondria. It is necessary to every single step of mitochondrial function. And the iron from animal meat is much better absorbed than the iron from plants. So, and you can improve that plant absorption if you soak, sprout, or ferment your grains, your nuts, and your seeds and your beans. Or you may need to supplement with some iron, like an iron bisglycinate, something like that. Certainly when you're doing vegan and vegetarian diets, it is possible to be healthy, and it requires a lot more intention, with the minerals and certain B vitamins, definitely certain kinds of proteins that are necessary. So yeah, I agree. It's all about the balance and being aware that some people go vegetarian and vegan for ethical reasons, some for health reasons, and for both, there needs to be an understanding that I do meet a lot of people who get low energy with not getting either enough protein and minerals in their diet or not being able to properly break down and absorb those minerals and protein that they are eating. So that was so beautiful. I 100% agree. And then the other topic that we're going to be getting into next is hormone balance. But before I do, one thing that is a poison to mitochondria is too much sugar. So it's like it's the toxins in the environment poison our mitochondria. Antibacterial medications like antibiotics can poison it. Tylenol, acetaminophen, paracetamol can poison our mitochondria. In fact, that's like one of the massive side effects from Tylenol is due to the effects of the poisoning of the mitochondria in our liver. The liver has a lot of mitochondria. It's a very active organ. So yeah, I 100%, I love it. This has been such a good start. And even if you just watch this, you'll take away so much for your energy. So let's go on to the second topic, which is hormone imbalance. And this is a big one, right?
Oh my gosh, is it ever? I mean, I'm of course biased because this makes up the practice that I have, right? Where people are coming to see me because they're seeing hormonal imbalance. And they may not know that it's hormone imbalance until they start seeing symptoms, right? And one of those major symptoms, as we said, and the reason why this whole talk is happening is because people are noticing that they're low in energy and they're attributing that to hormonal imbalance. And they're probably right because what we know about mitochondrial health and how it plays into metabolic health, which then connects to hormone health as a whole, is you remember how I said that chemical processes do everything in our body? One of the chemical processes that are happening in our body at any moment is the creation of hormones. And the creation of hormones happen based on, well, what's happening in the external environment and how does our internal environment have to then respond to that cue, right? So when we're having mitochondrial dysfunction, the other thing that mitochondria do, apart from creating energy, is within the mitochondria, that's where our hormones are built.
I
So
know, I found that out.
imagine,
I was like, what?
right? Like if our mitochondria are not happy campers, we do not have the basics for hormonal balance. We just don't, right? If they don't have the energy to create the hormones, if they are being poisoned by the things in our environment, if we are not giving them the nutrition that they need in the form of high minerals, they're just not going to be able to create hormonal balance. And so this is where we see a little bit of this problem that it's cyclical, because we notice hormonal imbalance happening because of mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria is not being happy. Then they stop really creating good hormones. And then we start feeling tired, which also means that, well, mitochondrial health is failing once more because we're more tired. So you can tell that this whole problem will feed into each other, right? In this sort of vicious cycle. But this is why, if you are noticing fatigue, you can kind of put your thinking cap on and say, oh, I wonder if it has something to do with my mitochondria. Hormone imbalance will always respond to what's happening in a mitochondrial environment. So these topics all kind of segue into one another. The other thing that will happen from a hormonal perspective is that mitochondria, they call the shots. They are going to say, yes, speed up, or they'll get information from our brains saying, and our thyroid in particular is saying, okay, speed up the production of something or slow down the production of something. That's why we call our thyroid our master gland, right? Our master metabolic gland. That will, as a result of what is happening or not happening in the internal environment, will slow up or speed down. So oftentimes the thyroid, if it's slowing down, it slows down everything. It slows down the production of hormones. It's slowing down the production of our fertility hormones, things like estrogen and progesterone. It might be speeding up other inflammatory processes. There's a lot that might be happening here. So if you're noticing hormone imbalance, or if you're noticing fatigue, it could be pointing to some hormonal imbalance related to your thyroid. And the other thing is that it can also be related to other things, that other areas that dictate what our hormones are doing. Could be related to our blood sugar. That's so overlooked. And Patricia, I know that you are part of the blood sugar balance passionate team. Like if there were a team somewhere where we can go and stand on the sidelines and cheer for blood sugar balance on a daily basis, I think you and I will both be there with the big billboards. Like we are such blood sugar balance fangirls. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
But,
it
right?
matters. It matters.
Yeah, because
Totally.
blood sugar balance is like one of those things that just impacts our hormones in a massive way. When we end up with blood sugar imbalance, it is telling our internal environment something very different, that it needs to start acting on, and it will start drawing on additional resources that our mitochondria then have to go and create. And if our mitochondria are tired or like they're not getting what they need, then they're going to have problems doing that. Right. So it's a very high level that we're giving you. There's of course the very specifics. I think you've been really great at providing some specifics for the crowd. But if you wanted to go into detail on how that works with blood sugar, we can talk about that too.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to comment on is that so we looked at the microscopic view of blood sugar and hormone production, where the hormones, particularly cortisol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, are all actually made in the mitochondria, as you mentioned, right? Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. I don't know. I kind of pictured them being made inside of the cells, floating around in like the liquid of the cell, but they're actually made in the mitochondria. And then the bigger picture is that, let's say when we talk about blood sugar, we're not talking about the fact that you shouldn't have sugar in your blood. You need to have sugar in your blood. When you eat your plant-rich diet with your lots of minerals, it's going to have lots of carbohydrates in it from the vegetables, from the whole grains, the nuts, the beans, the seeds. Those carbohydrates get broken down nice and slowly because they're packaged in fiber. And as they're broken down nice and slowly because of that packaging of the fiber by Mother Nature in your gut, your blood, the sugar that from that carbohydrates, all carbohydrates do turn into simple sugars over time. That's what digestion does. So sugar is not bad so long as it is released in small, moderate amounts at a slow rate. And what you're in from the gut into the blood. And then inside the blood, if you were to measure that blood sugar response, that blood sugar level, you would see after you eat your meal that the blood sugar slowly rises in level. The level of blood sugar slowly rises, and then it gets to a certain peak, not too high, not too low, and then it slowly goes down again. And as there's sensors in the body for that, like the pancreas, which is the organ that makes insulin, which is one of your sugar hormone. One of the things that insulin does is it responds to the sugar in your blood. And the way it responds is that the pancreas senses the blood sugar, gets the insulin production going and puts the insulin into the blood. The insulin floats around all through the body. And in small amounts, it knocks gently a little bit at the doors of your cells. Some of those doors open in the cells across the body. Those are the cells that are going to use the sugar as an energy source for that mitochondria to make energy out of, right? That's some of the food for the mitochondria to make the energy. And then so that blood sugar slowly goes into the cells and your blood level slowly drops down again. That's what you want, is that Goldilocks zone, not too high, not too low, nice and steady. But if you eat something that has lacking the packaging of the fiber around the carbohydrates, so that's fruit smoothies, that could be protein bars with the sugars hiding in there. So I'm going to kind of list the healthy foods first that people are like, oh, I thought this was healthy for me, but actually has a lot of hidden sugars in it. So that's the fruit smoothies, the protein bars, the protein powders, a lot of like gluten-free foods, right? Where it's like they have very highly refined. So when you take a whole grain like rice or a wheat or an amaranth, a tuff, a buckwheat or quinoa, if you take that and you grind it down and you process it into a fine powder, now you're that in addition to the obvious sugars, like the white sugars that go into pastries and breads and cookies and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of processed breads that last forever on the shelf, they have a lot of those simple sugars that will go into your blood, cause a massive spike of sugar in your blood. Your insulin gets dumped out from the pancreas in huge amounts because it sees a massive rise in blood sugar all of a sudden, right? Because instead of being slowly broken down, it's quickly released from the gut into the blood. Big, huge spike, big, huge insulin release. What happens is a ton of insulin is floating through the body, a ton of doors open on the cells, a ton of sugar rushes into the cells, and boom, your blood sugar tanks. And what you get in that moment is low energy. And that's why a lot of people get that afternoon energy slump, right? So there's two reasons for that afternoon energy slump, two major reasons. And the first major reason is those what I call fast carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates. They go fast in, fast up, fast down, too low, boom, energy slump.
Yes. And we'll get cravings, right? Just in that moment where we see that dip happening, we're going to get these massive cravings for, guess what? More of those fast carbohydrates, because our body sees that low dip as a threat. And at that point, we'll request the brain to say, oh, my human is in danger. Let's make sure that we can bring this blood sugar level up. And the fastest way that we know how to do that is through those fast carbohydrates, right?
Right, exactly. And the solution to that is to replace those fast carbohydrates with slow carbohydrates. So having, even a sourdough bread, like a good quality whole grain sourdough bread, That sourdough fermentation process, the buggies eat up the sugar. It has less sugar in it. Still got a lot of the fiber around it, right? So there's some things, but having, for example, some carrots with a bit of hummus instead of crackers, with hummus on top, like those small switches through the
Yes.
day, and especially the breakfast time, right? Having like a bowl of rolled oats porridge, like the real kind, not the cereal off the shelf kind that's highly processed. So there's those fine details, but being aware of this information, even as a first step, is really key. And it would take a whole other show to talk about how to go into all of those things. But one
Correct.
thing that we can go back to hormone imbalance, but I did mention that there were two things that can cause a big dip of energy through the day. And that is the third often overlooked cause of fatigue, which is the adrenal stress response.
Oh, yeah. And right. So, as it pertains to blood sugar, when we do have that dip that you mentioned before, we have that response, right, to intake a little bit more carbohydrate or more processed sugar or something to increase that blood sugar. But the other thing that happens is that stress hormones get released, because remember I said that our bodies perceive that dip as a threat. The threat, what our body does in the face of any threat, is that it releases stress hormones. And one of those things is cortisol. So cortisol gets released. It ends up taking not only resources from the rest of our body's regular functioning, but it starts to hijack things as well. Cortisol is not bad. It needs to happen. This is a very human, very healthy response. The problem is, if we're triggering cortisol just based not on a real threat, like someone coming at us, that we need to protect ourselves from, but we're triggering it because we had something for breakfast and this other thing for lunch and this fruit smoothie in the middle. These are things that we keep on tapping on our adrenals and producing that cortisol response. Guess what? All the resources that's supposed to go to our regular chemical functioning of our bodies are now going towards fueling the stress response, which then robs our body's ability to create hormones in a healthy, balanced way. So this is why I'm so happy that we went into that much detail on blood sugar, because blood sugar is one of those things that impacts mitochondria directly, right? Because we mentioned that it will speed up or slow down, normally speed up the way that mitochondria has to then produce energy or create energy based on these extreme lows that we're creating, right? And it also impacts our hormones in a really substantial way, because it's then stealing resources in many ways from healthy hormone balance. All of these things, what happens when you're stressed out? What happens if you've been stressed out for the entire day and you finally get home? You're tired, right? Your body feels that fatigue. That's exactly what's happening in our internal state. We're feeling and fueling this adrenal stress response. And then all of a sudden, we will have to come down from that. We will have to come down into a slump of energy. And it's because the mitochondria can't keep up. They just can't. And the hormone response can't keep up with this continuous knocking on the door of stress in the adrenals. So this is why we will see fatigue in the face of continuous adrenal response. And then the other thing that we can do to really, one thing that we probably need to talk about, the complete opposite of that heightened adrenal state, is what we call our parasympathetic nervous system state. So our nervous system has two different modes, right? Oh, are we skipping ahead? Okay, let's do that. Yeah. You see, these things all work together.
Before we go to the nervous system, I just wanted to make a few comments on the adrenal stress response, because you did such a lovely job of explaining how being in that state of stress, and it's in today's modern world, it's so many things are setting us into stress. It's the children, their behaviors kind of trigger you. It's the work environment, it's the commute, it's listening to the news. And so many of us are in this constant state of stress, which is not normal for humans in terms of evolutionary. Usually it used to be the occasional time you'd run into like a tiger in the jungle, or there'd be a war between tribes, that kind of thing. However, in today's modern society, it's day in and day out, and maybe you get a break from it if you're like on vacation. And even then, there can be some, stress with traveling. So, and it's the perceived stress. So people say, well, I can't remove stress from my life. And the answer to that is you can't remove stress from your life. You can change the way you perceive it and react to it. There are many things you can do, like, some people meditate, breath work, doing more relaxing exercises like yoga, tai chi, qigong. And the interesting thing is that there are 3 stages of stress response, the third one being burnout, right? So if you've ever burned out, you know what that's like. It's like you're fine until you're not. And then it's like your energy levels tank so low that you need to take a break from life pretty much, or else you're going to just really get into trouble. But before you reach burnout, there's 2 phases before that. The first phase is what a lot of women are in, where they're coping with life, and they're almost like in a state of heightened energy, and they're doing all of the things, and they're like, I'm fine. Everything is great. I got it all under control. But inside, that stress, as you said, is just burning up all those resources. It's using up the minerals. It's using up the vitamins, vitamin C, zinc, all those things, right? And then you get to stage 2, where you start to see changes in your energy level through the day. And it's not like you're tired throughout the whole day, as in burnout, but you might be wired and tired. You might get your energy slump in the afternoon, but then be wide awake at nighttime. Or you wake up tired, you get this energy burst in the afternoon, and then by nighttime, you are just dead, exhausted. And that's because the adrenal gland, which makes the stress hormone cortisol, is starting to, as you say, be overburdened. And the term adrenal fatigue is actually popular, but not entirely accurate. What happens is the brain starts to realize that the adrenal glands are starting to suffer. And as the mastermind of the body, like one of the big controllers of what's going on in terms of telling the body what to do and body parts what to do, it basically tells the adrenal glands to just shut down. Like, not completely, but it's like, you know what? You are an overworked body part. Just turn down the dial and make less of that cortisol hormone, because you're just making too much, right? And cortisol is needed. A certain amount of cortisol is needed to wake up in the morning and be energetic, to maintain a certain amount of energy through the day, and to naturally go down at night so you fall asleep. So that, because the brain is slowly turning down the volume on the adrenal gland function, you start to see those patterns of dysfunction, of energy fluctuations all the way. And if you don't listen to that, if you don't respect those signals, that's when the function gets turned down. And if you were to do a test of the cortisol levels through the day, your cortisol levels would be like low, 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 low through the whole day, whereas it should be high in the morning, coming down in the noontime, further down in the afternoon, lowest in the evening, which then allows your melatonin, your sleep hormone, to go up. And if you don't have your cortisol hormone coming down, it's really hard for your melatonin hormone to come up. And that's when you start running into sleep problems. And sleep problems are caused by your blood sugar dipping too much while you're sleeping because you ate too many fast carbs around the nighttime, and or the melatonin cortisol dance being off because of your stress, right? Your stress response. And if you don't sleep well, you're going to be tired the next day. And guess what? If you don't sleep well, you're more hungry the next day. You're craving foods more the next day. And then you eat that fast carb, and this vicious cycle is just perpetuated. And the cool thing is, you just need to change one thing to begin with in that vicious cycle, right? and it could be like improving your stress perception and your stress response. It could be changing those fast carbs to slow carbs. But just starting with just picking one thing to work on will help improve that vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And if I can just add one more thing to that incredible explanation, practical explanation, but when cortisol is so high in the body, it just goes to show you how integral this dance, or how integral or important cortisol actually is. It can't go too low, it can't go too high. If it goes too high for too long, the body actually has this fail safe where it starts to convert cortisol into an inactive form so that it doesn't continue knocking on the door of the adrenals. It will convert it to what we call cortisone. What ends up happening is that when too much of it gets converted to cortisone, because we've continuously had this stress response, after a while, we have that very tired throughout the day kind of feeling, because what's happening is that whatever cortisol is around to be used, it's being converted to cortisone in a self protective mode. Our body is saying, I can't take another instance of cortisol knocking on the doors of my cells and asking me to upregulate things or do more, right? So I'm going to start to turn that dial down, make sure that cortisol is not hanging out in the body as much because I can't take the activation. And then what ends up happening is that's how you end up also feeling this fatigue. It's because it's you're almost underactivated at that point because you're in this burnout state, right? It's turning things
Totally.
off. You're burnt out because you're lacking nourishment. You're lacking also space. There's white space that your brain needs, but also you're lacking the balance between healthy levels of cortisol and completely unhealthy levels of cortisol that are just too much for your body to handle. And that's where we see
Yeah.
fatigue.
And it's amazing because it's the body's infinite wisdom.
Yes.
The fatigue is not the problem, it's a symptom of an underlying issue. And while it may seem like burnout is terrible, it's actually your body in some ways trying to protect you from yourself, from your actions day to day that have not been serving your body. So burnout is basically and I've gone through burnout,
Same.
hardcore.
Yes. And Patricia, what
I
would
think,
happen if we chose to just take some Red Bulls, right? In that
yeah,
moment. Like if we were the sort of
yeah,
people
coffee, yeah.
that had that fourth, fifth cup of coffee because we're burnt out, then can you imagine our bodies are just not, it's asking us to respond by increasing cortisol, and we can't. We're already in a cortisol deficient state, So it's
Yeah,
almost
exactly.
like making that problem worse.
Absolutely. And sorry for interrupting. Yeah, I get so excited when we talk about this stuff. It's so great. And I remember we were talking before we started this show that we wanted to talk about coffee, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting thing about caffeine is that one of the way it works to get us more energetic is it causes our body to release cortisol.
Yeah.
So that's and so caffeine can be a healthy, like coffee can be a healthy part of somebody's diet, so long as the foundation is stable for it. So if you're in a state of over cortisol production, you're living a very busy life, and you can be retired, by the way, and
Oh,
be
yeah.
in this high stress, like your to-do lists and, helping with family members and all those sorts of things. So it can affect anybody at any age, and children too, right? Children were very impacted during COVID, for example, adolescents, young adults. So this is not an older person condition. This is an any person condition. But us older people tend to reach for the caffeine to try to get our energy levels up. And that's just another hit to the adrenal glands. Whereas if I'm like right now, for example, I am in really good health, knock on wood. I meditate every morning. I do Qigong. I do breath work. I balance my yang activities in the day with the yin, like if I'm doing a lot of
Beautiful.
energy stuff, I bring in the relaxation. I can have coffee, and I like my Swiss water decaf coffee,
Oh, yeah.
30% caffeine, right? Non-chemical way of extracting caffeine on a full stomach. Because when you have it on an empty stomach, it's a direct absorption, very fast. A lot of that cortisol can get triggered, whereas on a full stomach, right? So like it after breakfast, for example, people who are highly stressed, living very highly stressed lives, like highly energetic lives, they're intermittent fasting, they're skipping breakfast, and they're having coffee first thing in the morning. That, especially in women who are more sensitive to this adrenal stress response than men, women have a more sensitivity to cortisol and its effects. That may result in you feeling energetic and losing weight and hitting those health goals. But over time, it will result, and research has shown that that kind of a lifestyle, skipping your meals, with the cortisol, adrenal gland stimulants like the caffeine, will result in hormone imbalance in the future more
Oh,
often
yeah.
than not.
Yeah, because we know that the raw materials that are used to build cortisol are also the raw materials that are needed to be used to build things like progesterone and estrogen. So, especially as a woman, if we are continuously shunting resources in the way of cortisol, then we do not have what we need to create our fertility hormones or our sex hormones, right? Especially in those that are going into menopause, where we really need as much as we can get. We are losing some of the function of some of these hormones, or they're depleting. They're going into a very natural state of decline. But that is why I think women, as they're approaching their menopausal years, become even more sensitive to adrenal dysfunction or adrenal insufficiency, because the adrenals play such an important part in preserving the amount of hormones that we just have, that we need to rely on into premenopause and menopause.
100%. Yeah, the ovaries retire and the adrenal glands take over in menopause, and they're the one of the major hormone producing organs is the adrenal glands in menopause. So if you are not supporting your adrenal function, you're going to have a really tough transition into menopause and a menopause experience. And
Yeah.
also, testosterone is one of those things that gets sacrificed with more cortisol. And so women experience lower libido, lower muscle mass, even though they're working out and eating good quality protein. They just can't put on that muscle if the testosterone is being sacrificed. So, yeah, this
Yeah.
is all super pertinent. And I love that we took a little bit more time to dive into that before going into our fourth cause, which is the nervous system stress response. So we had the adrenal stress response and now the nervous system stress response.
Right. Well, I mean, these two, and the reason why we entered that space of nervous system and parasympathetic. I use the word parasympathetic because these two, the adrenals, they really determine what's happening with our overall nervous system, right? They are the ones that if we are in a constantly stressed out state, it is going to alter our nervous system response. Our nervous system has two branches. One of them is what we call the sympathetic, the other one is what we call the parasympathetic. And different functions happen where you are within these two branches. So, if, for example, we're wanting to digest our food, if we're wanting to replenish what we've taken out during the day, our body will need to be in a parasympathetic state. That's what we call our rest and digest state. Oftentimes that in prehistoric time, or time before technology, we would naturally be entering this state later on in the evening after our commitments for the day are done. There's no blue light shining in our faces, there's no electricity, the sun goes down, and so our cortisol starts to dip, our melatonin starts to increase. We see this transition into parasympathetic so naturally, but in this modern age, we are constantly stuck on the other branch, the sympathetic, the active, the branch of our nervous system that also, it's helpful. It's not to be demonized. We cannot be stuck in our parasympathetic state forever, although that would be lovely. And we probably would get a lot of benefit from being in that parasympathetic state more. But unfortunately, what happens is we get stuck in that sympathetic state, which ends up being more activating, which is where our body is then using, taking resources, converting resources. Our mitochondria is taking the stuff that we have given it and it's converting it to energy. We have to remember everything exists in a balance. And you talked about yin and yang, right? You talked about yang activities being so necessary to balance the yin ones and vice versa. This balance needs to also occur with our nervous system. And when we spend all of our time in this sympathetic activated state, we're not able to access the other state of our nervous system that will allow for and facilitate replenishment, that would allow for and facilitate proper rest, digestion, refueling, and also from an energetic state, where there needs to be ample time that's not activated so that we can then think about our day, that we can reflect and work through emotions. Our bodies are energetic beings, right? Emotional, energetic beings. And so if we're stuck in this sort of state of constantly responding to things, we can't access this state of reflection. And that's when we end up getting a little bit of stagnancy in our emotions, which then, that would be a completely different episode and such a valuable one to go into, the mind and the body, and how, emotions get stored in the body and can form the basis of what we call pathology or disease, right?
I love that you went there because, it's so funny. And I was like, oh yeah, we're talking about physical fatigue, but there's also emotional fatigue. And, one way to differentiate between the two is to ask if let's say you're very tired and and I said, well, if I were to take you and put you on this like beautiful tropical island with everything at your fingertips, would you still be tired? Like you have no issues, no concerns, nothing on your plate. Everything has been solved for you. You just get to relax. Would you still be tired? If the answer is yes, I would probably still be tired at first, at least. Like I would be tired. Then it's more of a physical fatigue. But if you're like, if it's like, oh no, I would be totally fine. Like within a day, everything would be like amazing, right? That's the emotional fatigue that you're speaking of. And I think that's such a beautiful point to bring into this conversation, is that I find myself sometimes, and I will just do a little vulnerable share here, where it'll be the end of the day, and I've had a great day, and then I pick up my kids, and for whatever reason they're just like in a bad mood. You know how kids, they get into these little bad kid moods. Something happened in their day. Maybe they had too much sugar at school, so they're all over the place. We get home, and I'm doing the same things, but I'm also having to deal with their emotions, and I get emotionally fatigued. So after an hour or two, I'm just drained, and I'm not physically drained, right? I put them to bed, and all of a sudden I've got all this energy. They're in bed, they're well managed, everything is good. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm fine. Actually, I'm going to go read a book, or, do this, or do some gentle yoga. I've got all this energy now. That is an emotional fatigue, and it is real. And many of us probably have maybe a combination of both physical and emotional fatigue. It'd be rare to not have some kind of combination of the two.
You bring up such a good point, because again, you remember at the beginning of the conversation, you said that our adrenals, our body, is responding to threats, whether real or perceived. It doesn't matter what kind of threat it is. All that matters is that our body is perceiving it as a threat. So if your children are in a bad mood, if someone cut you off while you were driving, if someone accidentally, if they made you upset at work, or someone unintentionally did something, regardless of whether that is the case or not, your body has still perceived it as a threat and a stressor, right? So that emotional load that you're talking about, like I think women in particular need to be careful about this and think about mental load and how much mental load they're taking on a regular basis. Because when we're talking about stress, we're not just talking about, physical stress. We're and yes, there's the physicality of blood sugar balance and imbalance. There's physical things that are happening in our bodies when our blood sugar is imbalanced. They were talking about that, of course, but we're also talking about the emotional stress of having to think, okay, if I want to make this for dinner, then that means that I need to go to the grocery store between 2 and 3 because at 3 o'clock I have a meeting and at 4 o'clock I have to go pick up my kids. So if blah, 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 blah. And our minds are just constantly going, right? This mental load, if it's not shared, that pushes us into our sympathetic mode of nervous system activation, right? It is not allowing our bodies to replenish and refuel, our mitochondria to get what they need, our hormones to be balanced, our sleep to be regular. That's not happening in that mode.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how many times I talked to a woman who has undergone burnout, right? And then she says, oh, yeah. And when I had to leave my job on like short term disability, or I just had to completely leave my job and switch focus or whatever, well, they had to hire 2 or 3 people to do the work that I was doing. And you're just like,
Yes,
yeah, boundaries. Like we are so bad. I'm saying because I'm the same. Like that's what I was doing, is just saying yes to everything, not
totally.
valuing worth, not setting boundaries. And anyways, again, a whole other discussion, but I
Yeah.
100% agree with you.
Follow-up
The mental.
discussion needs to happen, obviously. But yeah, I mean, let's jump into this one because it's a biggie for
Yeah.
sure.
So the first thing for those of you who are listening is immune activation. And Anya put this one on there, and I love it because this one is a very frequently overlooked,
Oh yeah.
really overlooked issue. And we're switching gears quite a bit here because it's a totally different topic in a way. So go for it, Anya. I'm
In
so
a
excited.
way, well, let's think about look at supply and demand in the body. Let's think about it that way. You have a certain amount of energy to supply that's supplied to you for all of your functioning. Let's just say you're feeling tired and it can be reduced to simple supply and demand. Well, what's taking that supply? Things that may take that supply could be a stealth infection, right? What I mean by stealth infections are something that may be some little critter that might be living in your gut. Perhaps you went to Mexico on vacation, and I go to Mexico all the time. So I'm not saying don't go to Mexico. Please go to Mexico. It's beautiful. But you have a stealth infection, you picked up some little critter, there's something brewing in your gut that now has to be fed, right? It has to be, it eats just like everything else. It needs resources just like everything else. So oftentimes when we have these little critters that are living in our bodies in a stealthy way that we would not recognize, we are only recognizing it because all of a sudden we're tired, then we're tired because all of the resources are being taken by something else. Something else is going on. Resources get taken because there's immune activation. When there's something that's foreign in our bodies that our bodies are not quite aware of what it is or haven't really seen before, there's a lot of talk and a lot of conversation that needs to happen between our bodies' processes. What is this? Should we feed it? Should we not? Should we attack it? Should we not? Like there's just a lot of stuff that takes energy. Immune activation will happen when we have these stealth effect infections, and it will end up making us feel tired because now the supply that we had is being split amongst us living our regular lives and feeding critters that are not supposed to be fed and activating our immune system and sending the troops out to like make sure that these critters are being eradicated. This is why we get so tired when we're sick with a cold or a flu. It's because our immune system is activated and it takes resources from us. So imagine being low grade sick all the time, right? This is what happens sometimes. There's a low grade immune activation, there's a low grade immune system reaction that is happening on a regular basis and we just don't know. Maybe it's something in our gut. Perhaps it's something that we're eating that is not quite a food allergy. Like we don't get the itchy, scratchy, red, watery eyes. We don't get, or the swollen tongue, or we don't have an anaphylaxis or anaphylactic response to this food, but it is creating immune activation in our body. It's something that's setting off our immune system for one reason or another. And so if we're not getting this huge response, then the chances are we continue eating that food, right? And we continue consuming this offending food in a way that continuously brews an immune activation, which again will then have us walking around with a brewing immune response all the time, and then feeling the symptoms of fatigue. So this is a beautiful illustration of why fatigue is felt and we just don't know where it's coming from. It could very well be this, just
Oh
constant
my
immune
goodness.
activation.
100%. I mean, I've had issues with food sensitivities, and I did the elimination diet. I figured it out. Dairy and all these sorts of things, certain nuts. And I remember once we were driving and to go somewhere like a multi-day trip, and I was driving and we stopped somewhere to eat. And I guess they must have had something in the food that I ate that triggered my food sensitivity. I had such profound brain fog, which maybe in the past, I wouldn't have noticed it because it would have been my constant state and I just would have been someone who's just generally tired frequently. But for me, because I'm usually very high energy, it was such a contrast of my pre-energy and after eating that food energy levels that I almost fell asleep at the wheel, which I never do. I never almost fall asleep at the wheel. It was dangerous. I felt like I had to hold my eyelids open. It was so profound. And after my immune system settled down from that exposure, my energy levels came back. But 100%, things that activate your immune system, as you say, is food sensitivities, infections like Epstein-Barr virus, Lyme, mononucleosis, parasitic infections, those ones. Some people, electromagnetic frequency exposure can be really toxic for them on so many levels, and that can drain their energy. That is a much less frequent cause, but for some people who are more sensitive to those frequencies and radiations, that can happen. It's been proven to happen. So yeah, it's really paying attention to your body. And basically, if you have any sort of persistent issues with fatigue, now, if you are a breastfeeding mother and you are waking up through the night to feed your children or you're a mother and your children are awakening you at night, that's like an obvious cause of fatigue, and it is not actually pointing at some kind of system dysfunction, although lack of sleep obviously is negatively affecting your health, and my heart goes out to you because I've been through that myself. It is very hard to be in full bloom of health when you're in constant sleep deprivation. So what we are talking about more is those underlying causes that, if you're not aware of the potential effect, will contribute to fatigue that you can't figure out, that you just don't know the cause of. And when you don't know the cause, you can't take action. So now that we've raised awareness around these 5 crucial and frequently overlooked causes, you can now take action, right? And so if you're not sure what to do next, Anya, what are some quick things that people can start doing right away that would make a difference to them?
So at the top of this of this segment, we started talking, or not this segment, but the entire video, we were talking about switching your salts, right? And the reason why we want you to switch your salts, and this is really easy, you can do this today. Go and buy yourself a high quality salt for the mineral density, just mineral density in general. Think about exploring minerals, understanding what foods are containing high minerals. And there are foods that we're eating that will take minerals from us, and those are always going to be processed food. So processed foods will take minerals. We want to give more minerals, look at high sources of minerals. We have really colorful leafy greens. The more color we see in a plant, the higher the mineral density. So especially if you're choosing, say, a lettuce, if you're looking at romaine versus you're looking at one of those beautiful dinosaur type kales, right? With the very dark green leaves, we're going to see higher mineral density in that kale, right? We're not saying that romaine's not worthwhile. It has a lot of other benefits, other things like there's a good water content in romaine lettuce. But from a mineral perspective, you can identify high mineral foods and plants by looking at their color. The power is in the pigment. Okay, so just remember that and look for pigmented foods. The other thing that you can do is start to explore how to balance your blood sugar. That may be in something as simple as caffeine timing. So look at it. You had mentioned that you only have your coffee on a full stomach, and that's for good reason. So consider the time that you're having coffee. Don't have it too late at night. Just look at coffee in general as something that you may want to revisit your relationship with. I personally drink coffee again for the same reasons that you do, Patricia. And I do feel that there's a lot of people that are out there having it and not understanding that it may be depleting them further. So just think about coffee. Think about as well from a blood sugar perspective. Coffee goes into this, but think about how you're eating your carbohydrates. Are you having carbohydrates by themselves, or are you having them on a plate full of other things like fat and protein? Protein can be in the form of vegetable that is high in protein, or grain like quinoa, or it could be in the form of animal protein. It doesn't really matter, but what happens is that when we do have our carbohydrate, regardless of what kind of carbohydrate it is, in the presence of a fat or a protein, it will then slow down the absorption of the sugar in our bodies, right? Because protein and fats take longer to digest. They're a little bit more complex for the body to break down. And so when we're having them together when we're having a fat and a protein and a carbohydrate together, we're going to see that the rate of absorption is going to be limited by the breakdown of the fat or the protein, meaning that if those things take longer to break down, then we're going to see a breakdown rate of carbohydrate that's going to be slower as well, meaning that the sugars and the carbohydrates are going to then release in a slower way. So think about always pairing carbohydrate with a fat or a protein. And of course, staying away from those very highly processed carbohydrates, those fast carbohydrates that was mentioned before, that would really help. And then, of course, things like how do we get into our parasympathetic mode? We talked about nervous system mode, and there's so many other ways or ways that you can do this. It's very specific to you. Personally, I prefer breath work. So, breath work is my chosen modality to really help to push me into a parasympathetic mode, because when there's a threat coming at you, you're sure as heck not deep breathing, right? So if you're deep breathing, that is signaling to your body that you are safe. I like breath work because it's also something that you can do very quickly and silently. And it doesn't take too many resources. There are a lot of resources online that you can look up, or there's some apps as well that can be used. But look into breath work or some other version of a parasympathetic enhancer, right? We really want you to get into that mode. And then last, examine your relationship with foods. If you are noticing maybe a trend that you seem to get really bad brain fog after you have lunch, and you notice that every lunch you're having this particular type of bread, perhaps you start to look at, well, what is this bread made out of? And I'm starting to notice a trend when I do eat this particular type of bread and something that also contains the same foods or same items. Are you still noticing this brain fog when you have it at a different time? So start to experiment and maybe even log your energy. I really like doing that. And I tell my clients to do the same, is after they've had a meal, log some initial feelings, maybe in a journal or a calendar, but just say, had this for lunch or had typical lunch. There's a lot of people who are just lunch repeaters out there, and no shame, because we're all short on time and whatever works, works. But if you're noticing that it's making you feel a certain way consistently, then start to look into that deeper and consult with someone that may be able to help you look at that relationship a little bit deeper. Those are some very practical things you can do today.
I love it. And one quick thing I'll add is the exercise piece, because people, again, exercise is a balance. If you're not exercising enough, your mitochondria really thrive on just enough exercise. It gets them going and gets them like tuned up and revved up and, you know, just enough activity. But over exercising, a lot of us, well, I know before I hit my burnout, one of the problems is I was over exercising. I was exercising the same when I was menstruating versus when I was not, which, you know, you should do more gentle things when you're menstruating. And that whole thing, like, I'm going to hit the gym no matter how I'm feeling today. Yes, that's okay if what you're doing is overcoming like willpower issues. But if your body is truly depleted, you know, exercising through that may actually end up burning you out faster or causing issues. And, you know, definitely people who are engaged in ultra marathon. I mean, my dad was an Ironman. Those activities drain a lot of nutrients, a lot of minerals. It's very depleting. So if you want to keep doing that, you're going to have to really intentionally bring in a lot. That's a very yang, high energy thing. You're going to have to balance that out with massive yin, probably a lot of supplementation, to be honest, because you just won't be able to meet your demands with your food. And those of us who are busy days, busy lives, you know, all those things, children, family, all work, all that, oftentimes, even if you're eating a super healthy plate of food, you may just not be getting enough nutrients to meet those demands. And you may need supplementation. And that's something that sometimes I do bring in with people that I work with and that I recommend for that reason. But I don't think everyone needs to be on that. However, there are certain circumstances where you do need a bit more zinc, a bit more vitamin, D, vitamins, that kind of stuff. So even if you're on a very healthy diet, so if you've identified with some of these things and you're like, yeah, this is one for me, or if you're like, well, I'm actually pretty healthy and I'm doing all the right things, I'm eating all the right foods, but I'm still feeling drained, maybe, you know, it would be looking at the supplementation. And the last one is toxins, right? Toxins harming the mitochondria. So that's like often the hidden infections and the hidden toxins in our environment can be that missing piece for some people. Not everyone, but for some people. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. And we see that in the form of mold toxicity very often in my clinic, where it's like we've looked through everything. We've gotten them into parasympathetic. We have turned down the dial on their adrenal activation. We have, you know, made sure that their blood sugars are more balanced. And we just are still scratching our head as to why this person is dealing with fatigue. It can be because of an environmental toxin. And in that case, that's when, you know, if you've done these foundational things and you're still noticing that there is something else that may be brewing and dealing with or that is causing your fatigue, then that is when you start doing some further exploration. And that may be what we find: some toxin burden, some sort of mycotoxin in the environment, immune activation being caused by something external.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Anya. This
Oh
has
my
been the
God.
best. This is like a very long conversation we've had, and I think it's a reflection of how meaty and juicy and how wonderful like everything flowed. So I so appreciate you taking the time. Why don't you share with our listeners and viewers where they can find you if they want to connect and work with you on their hormones and gut health?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I am very active on Instagram. So you'll find me at the.well.nest, or sorry, at your.well.nest and on Instagram. And what I tend to do there is give you some really practical tips that you can implement in your life, just because I'm really passionate about breaking down barriers for access of information. We know that as more integrative and functional type practitioners, we know that there's just so much difficulty sometimes in accessing our type of care, and perhaps you're not ready for that. And so sometimes, what I think I can speak to for both of us, the foundational things are often what we want you to be able to do for free. We give that away for free as functional or integrative practitioners, because the foundational things are the things that will probably make the largest difference. So if you want some foundational tips and tricks, that's definitely where you can come and check me out and send me a DM. But otherwise, I was just so glad to have this conversation, regardless of the length. I think we put a lot into it because there's so much to talk about. And I welcome any questions that come out of this as well. So thank you for having me. I'm grateful, grateful beyond belief.
Oh, me too. It's been so lovely. And for those of you who are listening or viewing this, please, please save, subscribe, share, leave a comment, leave a testimonial. It helps spread the word. More people can benefit from it when they find it easier. And so I appreciate you tuning in today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, your night, and I'll see you at the next episode. Bye.